Hello and welcome to Within the Frame, where we bring today's most pressing global issues into focus. I'm Kim Mo-gen. The 29th conference of the parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, or COP29, is currently underway in Baku, Azerbaijan. On day one, nearly 200 nations agreed on a number of crucial ground rules for a credible, UN-backed international carbon market, ending a 9-year deadlock on Article 6.4 of the Paris Agreement. Countries will now be able to pay for their climate ills through credits abroad. Buyers, mostly in wealthier countries, would be able to meet their climate goals by buying credits from projects that cut pollution. Though delegates still need to negotiate further on the document, pundits say this would be an effective tool to direct resources to the developing world while implementing climate plans. For more on the latest on COP29, we are joined by Michael Grubb, Professor of Energy and Climate Change at the University College London. Welcome to the show, Professor.
Thank you.
And also joining us is Chung Seo-young, Professor at the Division of International Studies at Korea University. Thank you for joining us, Professor Chung.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me here.
Right. So let's start with Professor Grubb first. So this year marks the third consecutive year that an oil-producing country is holding the presidency, following Dubai and Egypt. What kind of significance does this hold? And could you also point out for us the importance of this year's COP29?
Well, I think it's partly accidental because the United Nations has a system whereby the conferences rotate between 5 regional groups in each year. So we had the Africa group, and Egypt was the strongest bidder there. The Asia Pacific group, and that went to Dubai. And this year was the turn of the Eastern European group, fairly broadly interpreted, which was a very difficult set of choices because previously it's frequently been taken by and hosted by Poland, but this time, because of the war in Ukraine, Russia had vetoed any East European member of the EU, at least. The rest of the world, or much of the West, vetoed Russia as host. So the remaining choices were rather limited, and the consensus in the end was to host Azerbaijan. Also, I think, not surprisingly, some of the oil exporting companies have bigger facilities, and you do need pretty big facility to host a COP of this scale. So those are the reasons. It has been commented on. There are various arguments oil producers have to understand and see what the climate change issue will imply for them. So it's not seen as wholly negative, but it has raised eyebrows.
Right. Can you also point out the importance of this year's COP29 for us?
Well, this COP29 had major agenda item on finance, which maybe we'll come on to later, but there were several other issues. One of them already quickly resolved in terms of the mechanisms that you referred to in the introduction. But generally now it's taking on a whole new significance in the light of the US election and President Trump. So I think partly this will be seen as a test of the extent to which the rest of the world is actually determined to keep the United Nations process going on climate change. It's not the first time it has had to deal with, in effect, a unilateral withdrawal from the United States. But this time maybe the stakes are higher.
Right. Now let's circle back to the Article 6.4. On the first day of the conference, countries agreed on the carbon trading rules under Article 6.4 of the Paris Agreement. Professor Grubb, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, I mean, it's good to have agreed the rules. As you said, it's been many, many years in negotiations, and there's a basic tension that had to be resolved or reach a compromise, which is between the countries that were taking on quite ambitious targets and their industries saying, look, we could help to reduce emissions elsewhere, perhaps more cheaply, and that would also help to provide resources to developing countries or other activities. But the real concern has been if these rules are too loose, then targets start to become less clear and determined. And, what can you count as an investment abroad, which will alleviate the extent to which you have to deliver at home? It's not a new issue for the United Nations climate process. We had a mechanism under the Kyoto Protocol called the Team Development Mechanism, which had quite a robust intergovernmental monitoring process. The agreement at the beginning of this week, in effect, is the first major block of reinstating a global governance of what actually it means to generate one of these credits, which will either reduce emissions elsewhere or in this case have added the potential to absorb carbon dioxide, called CDR, carbon dioxide removal, that would offset against emissions elsewhere.
Right. As you've mentioned, not everyone was happy with the fast-track decision-making process on Article 6.4. What are people's major concerns?
Well, I think the process concern is that it was taken by the supervisory body and in effect handed back to the UN COP almost as a fait accompli. So there's a sense that countries didn't actually get to engage directly in full with decisions. I think amongst the countries there were varied views about that process, some reservations expressed, but also a recognition that it was very helpful for the COP to get that hangover out of the way quickly. And obviously governments have been discussing it offline for a long time. Then you also have the substantive concerns from people who are just uneasy about this whole process of offsetting emissions when they say, look, the main fact is we have to reduce emissions, and some of the rest of this is a distraction and perhaps enables a bit of greenwashing of it's not really a proper emission reductions or it won't lead to the long-term solutions of absolute reduction. So there's been considerable unease from environmental groups about some of the content implications. Some details still have to be worked out, along with the reservations about a rather speedy process in the final stage.
Mm-hmm. Now let's invite Professor Chung into the conversation as well. As for South Korea, it has committed to reducing its national greenhouse gas emissions by 13% through international offsets by 2030. Professor, why is international carbon reduction efforts very important, and what are effective ways to achieve this?
Well, under the Paris Agreement, in principle, that emission reduction activities needs to be done through the implementation of the NDC, nationally determined contributions by each country. However, there is one very unique article under the Paris Agreement, that's Article 6, which allows the countries to implement NDCs by engaging international, bilateral, sometimes unilateral cooperation. Because Korea has a very energy-intensive industrial structure, it's just difficult to reduce greenhouse gas emissions as much as we want, thinking about the potential cost of the reductions. Instead, Republic of Korea can be engaged with activities under Article 6 by utilizing and developing the emission reduction activities overseas. Thereby, we can not only help other countries to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but also sharing the reduced emission outcomes for the implementation of the Korean NDC. In that sense, it can be a very cost-effective. Also, it can be a very good way of Korea's engaging with, especially developing countries, actually to meet the 1.5 degree target under the Paris Agreement.
Right. And also, Professor, another key issue at COP29 is the establishment of a new collective quantified goal for climate finance. For starters, could you explain for us what the NCQG is and why it matters?
Right. Very few people know this very important factor, that if we read Article 2 of the Paris Agreement, which is about objectives of the Paris Agreement, there are actually three objectives. First, mitigation. Second, adaptation. Third, ensuring financial flow. So all the features of the Paris Agreement comes with how we can invest, low carbon and carbon neutral technologies with adequate financing for both developed and developing countries, especially in case of developing countries, because of the lack of their capacity to secure sufficient financing, even back to the 2009 Copenhagen Accord, countries agreed to meet $100 billion per year. And this number needs to be updated So countries are supposed to agree prior to 2025, using the baseline of 100 billion US dollars, maybe increasing more so that there will be a more financial flow guaranteed to implement the Paris Agreement. In that sense, NCQZ has become the central element of the negotiation in this COP29 here in Baku.
Right, so it's become the standard. Now, the debate between developed and developing nations over the scale of climate finance and the specifics of its implementation is expected to intensify until November 22nd. Professor Chung, what are key points of contention?
Right. I don't think any country in this COP would say that I don't agree on increasing the goal.
Right.
However, there are differences in details. There are several elements that the countries are still need to negotiate on and agree on ultimately. First is structure and scope, right? What kind of finance sources are important, right? Developing countries may prefer grants like ODA, without having any conditions. And then the developed country side, they will say, well, not only grants, but there are other innovative and creative finance resources available so that we can bring more private sector's involvement. So this structure and the scope is one of the important element that the countries needs to agree on. Second, of course, how much are we going to increase the goal? Right, amount of the goal, and then developing countries sounds like they prefer 1 trillion US dollars, and then the developed countries who are supposed to provide more financial assistances to developing countries, they will say, well, we recognize the importance of increasing the goal, but not maybe that much. We need to discuss about it. And the third, from the developed countries' point of view, it's important for us to provide financial assistances to developing countries. However, we want to make sure that these money will be used to ensure the implementation of NDCs of developing countries so that actually there will be a contribution of actual reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, not using for other purposes. There are several elements that the countries are discussing on that.
Right, so they have different positions on that front. Then, Professor Grubb, what could be potential solutions to bridge the gap between developed and developing countries on the issue of climate finance?
Well, it's bound to be a very thorny issue, as already outlined. It always is, I think, between donors and recipients. Nothing new there, but no question there's going to be a lot of tensions over this. I think the options, a few areas. One is actually making smarter use of public money that's been available, particularly for mitigation now. There are lots of technologies that could accelerate emission reductions. They are fairly economic depending upon the level of risk that investors see. So using public money more to help guarantee or underwrite the risk of investments in renewable energy, for example, in developing countries, looks increasingly attractive, and it certainly would leverage a lot more private money than the public money you would need to set aside to underwrite those risks. So first of all, smarter use of the public resources. That also would enable perhaps more of the money to shift towards adaptation, which has been a long-standing request of developing countries. It's a lot harder to make money out of adaptation, whereas investing for renewable does generate a stream of energy to be sold. Second, I think new sources of finance need to be considered. There are a number of possibilities, a number of them connected one way or another with our policies around fossil fuels. Most obviously, putting a price on carbon is something that economists often recognize because it tries to reflect the damage that otherwise is not being considered by those using fossil fuels or making it. So, for example, South Korea has an emissions trading system. Many others do, including China. In Europe now, there's a very high degree of auctioning those allowances, so they're not given out for free. That generates a lot of money. Europe is now also moving to have a border-related levy for imports. In my view, that money would be legitimately and sensibly made available for international climate finance. So I think linking carbon revenues in some ways. And a final observation, just to emphasize, we've struggled to deliver 100 billion when we actually look at the revenues to fossil fuel companies, it's 10 times that generally. During the energy crisis, we published an analysis, the energy crisis of 2022. The additional profits above expectations amounted to oil and gas companies amounted to about $500 billion. And that was in 1 year of energy crisis. And that's split between companies where I think one could certainly consider a supernormal profits tax and publicly owned companies. Many of them, for example, in some of the developing countries like Saudi Arabia or other state-owned companies. And I think there should be an open discussion about those sheer scale of revenues associated with the activities which are driving climate change.
Right. Now, at the beginning of our discussion, we also had to touch upon the U.S. elections. And of course, concerns have been raised about potential impact of Donald Trump's re-election on global climate finance. Now, even if climate finance goals for developing countries are set at COP29, there could be possibilities for Trump to withdraw from such commitments. Professor, what is your perspective on this?
My perspective is a lot of people like to use diplomatic language, but I think you said it could. It seems extremely likely that the world is going to have to contend with a US president who will refuse to honour any commitments made by the present administration still in power just for another couple of months, because they've always been hostile to international finance of most descriptions. So that's going to put the system under real strain on the international finance. I don't know exactly how the negotiations will handle that. I have no doubt, though, that the other developed countries will be saying, obviously, the extent to which this can be delivered will be contingent on whether or not the US contributes. So that's going to be a big headache for the process. And one of the reasons why the world failed to deliver so long, to deliver the 100 billion, the pre-existing, didn't do so till 2022, 23, was the fact of the previous Trump administration. So on finance, it's going to be difficult. It'll also be difficult on the politics of it. But I think reactions remain to be seen on the wider political impact. Obviously, some countries may want to use it as an excuse to pull back if they say the world's, still richest country is pulling away from the Paris regime. I think you may also see a reaction of, this treaty took years and years to negotiate. Countries have been abiding by its terms. They are proceeding with their commitments, and they're not willing to let any country, not even the US, completely disrupt and destroy a global treaty of this nature. And that may provoke countries to actually be more insistent on their commitment to tackle climate change, because at the end of the day, whether or not the US is part of it, the same problem remains for the planet and all countries in the world.
Right. By the year 2025, countries will need to submit updated nationally determined contributions, NDCs, like we mentioned a while ago, for emissions reductions. And COP29 is expected to shape the direction of these updates. And we're aware that Professor Chung will be taking part in panel discussions regarding this issue over there. Professor, what is your outlook on this, and what kind of steps is South Korea taking in this regard?
Well, so I know that the government of Republic of Korea is still working on preparing for the updated NDC now. I know that they are working really hard in order to come up with very ambitious target and other related plans within the NDC. Here. The question is, what's going to be the level of the ambitious target to reduce greenhouse gas emissions? That's number one. And number two, what are inside? How we can actually use it in a way of creating new jobs and boosting the new economy by deploying new technologies and then bringing the more investments into new area of the opportunities. And then I'm sure that the government is working really hard to come up with these details. In principle, that the Korean government is supposed to finish its work by end of this year, and then it might take a little bit more time, as I expect, because many other countries are preparing for the submitting NDC. But it seems to be they need to have a little more time to finish up the final documentation. So in that sense, I would like to say that Korea's NDC will be good enough to show to the entire world that Korea is making good contributions and to play a bridging role between the developed and developing countries. And then we will see how it finally comes in.
Right, let's look forward to that. Now, finally, given the severity of the global climate crisis, Professor Grubb, what are your thoughts on the importance of global climate action and the efforts needed to address this crisis?
Well, maybe I'll comment first on NDCs. A few countries have started coming out with their proposed NDCs or their committed pledge. So Brazil did so recently with a significant reduction. The United Kingdom, I should say, it's in a slightly unusual position. The United Kingdom has reduced its greenhouse gas emissions by more than 50% since 1990, largely, but not only because we've transformed the electricity sector with a very large increase of renewables and closure of our last coal plant last month. So the UK Prime Minister came to COP and earlier this week on the back of an already existing ambitious commitment for 2030 to go well beyond that 50% reduction achieved. He said that the UK NDC number will be 81% below 1990 levels. Now, I think that certainly has caught the eye. The UK does not have a complete implementation plan, but it is a clear signal that the UK has, in practice, once it's made a commitment, found it easier to reduce emissions than expected. And now that it has a much cleaner electricity system, is now looking at accelerating the rollout, for example, through electric vehicles in transport and industrial electrification. Some of it has been trade effect, but that is actually rather marginal in the current plans for this reduction. So the UK is hoping that that will really set something of a standard, or at least a challenge to other countries to say, if the UK, a strong G7 economy, can do this, surely others can up their game in terms of the level of ambition of NDCs.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So I think it's going to make for a very interesting year as countries come forward with their commitments, and we shall see what that looks like a year from now or during the course of the next many months.
Right. So with that driver, let's hope that the world powers could ramp up contributions in their efforts to tackle climate change. Professor Grubb and Professor Chung, thank you so much for your time and your expertise tonight. We appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you for joining us on Within the Frame. Be sure to tune in again next time as we continue to explore the stories that matter. Until then, stay informed and engaged.